So this week we are talking about business models, renewal, and change. Sounds like I just threw a bunch of words together, but I swear there is a connection here. So first things first, let's talk about terminology. What's a business model versus strategy? So all companies have a business model, but not all companies have a strategy. The business model is the logic of how a company creates and captures value. You might see a slightly different definition in the reading this week. I have two models here on the slide from two different authors. One is Casa de Seuss, which you are reading this week. The other one is Clayton Christensen's model of what a business model is. So there's not quite consensus on how to conceptualize a business model. But think of it this way. I actually prefer the Clayton Christensen model here. It talks about what's the value proposition that a business offers, what's the profit formula, how does it actually make money, what resources does it use to engage in that activity and make money, and what are the processes that kind of tie those resources together and engage them to create value. The Casa de Seuss model is a little bit more about the choices a company makes, the consequences that a company faces based on those choices, and it also relates to a company's activities, what resources it engages, but Casa de Seuss provides a slightly more flexible idea of what a business model is. So a strategy represents a choice regarding how to compete. So a business model follows from a strategy. You choose to do certain activities. You choose to engage certain resources. You choose how all these things relate to one another based on a strategy. But even if you never sat down and thought about what's our firm's strategy, you would probably have a business model just because you're engaging in activities, you're using resources, whether you know it or not, and hopefully you're generating a profit. So why am I talking about business models the same week I'm talking about innovation, change, resilience? So first of all, when you think about industries being disrupted or transformed, and we learned a couple models, the pestle and the 5 forces, to think about how industries operate. One of the biggest threats an existing or incumbent player in an industry faces is a competitor with a different business model. So picture here the taxi industry disrupted by Uber, for example. Clayton Christensen, who you aren't assigned to read, but who gave us that lovely business model image from the last slide, would probably say Uber wasn't really disrupted by the definition of disrupt, but that's a complete aside. The point is these industries are facing change from, if we were looking at the Porter's 5 forces model, we'd say substitutes, because they're not operating the exact same way that existing incumbents are operating. And this is one of the things we've seen over and over again in the past few decades. And this is really how industries transform and change in this very way, shape, and form. It's through business model competition. So there are some critical capabilities for a firm to ensure its own longevity. So recognizing opportunities. When is there a revolution underfoot? How do you become resilient? When is there industry renewal happening? We'll talk about what those things mean in a second here. How do you create a resilient and adaptable business model? And we'll talk about the concept of organizational agility here in a second. So I also asked you to think about the industry life cycle model this week. Gave you a real straightforward short reading on it. But a part of this is that industries aren't static. Industries change. And they go through kind of a predictable pattern many times. We don't know how long this industry life cycle will take, but it will likely happen. introduction, growth. Some models of the industry life cycle include a shakeout phase, some don't. Maturity and decline. But once an industry goes through decline, there's also something not on this chart, which is renewal. You see, for example, tobacco companies, which have long been in this category of decline, investing in cannabis startups, investing in vaping, so things that are adjacent to what they currently do, but may offer an industry with greater growth prospects. I show you this chart. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I show you this chart because each phase has distinct characteristics. So if you were to say, what phase of the industry life cycle is this particular industry in, you could consult this and think about it because it helps you think about the prevailing strategies that companies use, how they compete, whether they're facing more price competition versus competing on product characteristics, and a lot of other aspects of identifying how the logic of a particular industry works. Anyway, so I mentioned I'd get back to this idea of change and resilience. And I also think one of your readings this week makes a really good argument as to why it even matters that firms stick around, because you see firms go away and fade away all the time. This is top of mind for me because I worked at General Electric. I worked at GE Capital, which was their financial services business, which already got sold off a few years ago. But now GE itself, the storied conglomerate that was on the Dow Jones Industrial Average for over 100 years, is breaking up into 3 different companies. And yeah, for my personal history, it makes me a little sad. I'll miss, well, maybe I won't always miss working at GE, but it was a part of my history. And it's this storied company. Should society at large care that these companies go away? There is some argument to be said that it's kind of inefficient if everything, if there's a lot of turnover all the time, that everything is a startup. Because, once again, going back to that industry life cycle model, startups are trying new things, figuring out what the standard will be for an industry. They're not super efficient in terms of cost in generating goods or services in a cost-effective manner or distributing them widely. So while growth companies and startups are really exciting, an entire economy composed of growth companies and startups is maybe not the best thing for society at large. So there is some vested interest in preserving these longer-lived institutions. So it became popular about 20 years ago to start talking about organizational agility. And then about 10 years after that, the idea of ambidexterity became really popular. So up until this point in this class, we've talked about strategic fit. Cassidy-Seuss talks about these virtuous cycles that reinforce elements of the business model. When we did the Trader Joe's case, we talked about how different activities reinforce one another and make this internal alignment of activities. So the trade-off there to have a strong internal alignment is sometimes you lose flexibility. Agility is all about the flexible organization. There's an entire world of literature out there in the management space about achieving organizational agility. So how do you have good strategic alignment, good fit of activities, operate efficiently, and then also be ready for anything? So that's when you get into this concept of ambidexterity. But like all things in strategy, there are trade-offs. If you maximize fit, you're sometimes doing that at the cost of agility and vice versa. So while we're not going to dive deep into the ambidexterity literature in this class, I do want you to be aware that this is a debate in management and something you may come across in your career as you're working at an organization and you wish it were a little more flexible, to think about where on the spectrum between achieving that alignment and fit and reinforcement of activities versus achieving agility do you need to be? And sometimes it varies quite a bit depending on where a company happens to be in the industry life cycle. Agility is more important towards the beginning of an industry life cycle, and also at the end when you're recognizing the opportunity or looking for opportunities for renewal. Oftentimes in that middle part of the life cycle, that growth stage and maturity stage, strategic fit is more rewarded. So this was just a cursory look at some of these concepts that ties into some of your readings this week. And if you have questions on these, I'm happy to guide you towards more literature. I wish I could assign you more readings, but you probably wish I couldn't. So thanks again for joining me in this week's video.